Good afternoon, everyone. I got that right because usually we're on an evening schedule, but thank you for coming out a little early. We've moved this up to 4 o'clock, and we're glad to have you all here. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West, and this is our first scholar lecture of the spring 2026 semester. And we've got a very interesting topic for you, as I think you can see on the screen. Let me thank our folks from Greenspun Hall here at Greenspun College who are recording the event. So in a day or two, it'll be up on our YouTube channel. So if you have friends or colleagues who you think would be interested, they can always check it out there, as will the PowerPoint that will accompany the lecture, so you don't have to strain yourself taking notes. That'll also be available to you. I want to welcome you on behalf of our executive director, David Damore, and all our staff at Brookings Mountain West, including a few students I see or pretend to see scattered out there. 15 years, and I still am not used to the bright spotlight down here for the recording. Let me just tell you a little bit about our colleague who's here with us, making his first visit as a Brookings Scholar. And like all our scholars, he's been giving classroom presentations, meeting with business and community leaders, and is going to talk to you tonight on the rise of the global middle class. Homi is a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development in the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. Prior to joining Brookings, he spent 26 years at the World Bank, where he had an incredible global experience. So we have someone who is perfectly qualified to talk about this interesting topic. So I'll turn it over to our speaker.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I want to talk to you today about the middle class. I hope it's a topic that you can relate to, because I suspect that most of you would self-identify as being in the middle class. For the students who are here, your choice of going to college, people have probably told you that going to college is your ticket to joining the middle class. And I think the question that I really want to put on the table is, we've had a long period of close to 200 years where the global middle class has systematically expanded. It's brought prosperity to literally billions of people, as I'll go into in some detail. And it's really been the ticket to what people call the good life. And that's in the subtitle. I'll tell you a bit more about what I mean by the good life during the course. And yet now things seem to be different. And the gist of what I'm going to talk about is that two big things have changed. One is that because the middle class has expanded so much and so rapidly over so much of the world, it's generating pressures that none of us can ignore on the planet and on planetary health. And people just don't believe that continuing the way that we've been going is sustainable into the future. So there's all kinds of questions about what can we do about all these things. I mean, I can outline this long list of climate change and ocean acidification and species loss and all the rest of it. I think you can all relate to those issues about what's happening to the planet. But at the same time, while we have to deal with all of these issues, there's another set of issues, which is that people who are in the middle class aren't actually all that happy about being in the middle class. So that really puts a spanner in the works, because if you're not, why do it if it's ultimately not something that ends up being something that you want to do and you get enjoyment and fulfillment from? So those are really the big questions that I think I'd like to explore. Why is it that now, at this moment in time, because of all these threats to the planetary health, should we be thinking about the middle class? And second, does anyone care about the middle class any longer? Is that really what we should all be aspiring to? And my answer is going to be yes, but yes only under some conditions. And I think the interesting part about this is that the middle class is a class. It's a class in the very traditional sense of the term, a group of people that has some things in common that they want to get done. And I think what I'd like to suggest to you is that, yes, the middle class and the scale of the middle class is the source of many of our problems, but equally, because of the power of the middle class, it's the middle class from which the solutions will come. So that is basically what I want to say and argue. And so first, scale. What are we talking, when we say the middle class, what are we talking about? I'll come to some definitions a bit later on, but more or less, what we're looking at is in a few years' time, 2030, 4 years hence, roughly speaking, we're talking about 5 billion people in the middle class. This is no longer a small segment of society. This is a majority of the world's population being in the middle class. It's an awful lot of people. And what they do, and obviously what they consume, is going to have a massive impact. Now I'm going to give you something about time trends. So I would argue that the growth of the middle class is actually the single greatest economic megatrend of our time. And if you go back in history, let's say 1820, 1830, before the start of the Industrial Revolution, you don't have a middle class. The global population was about just over 1 billion people. Maybe 10 million people, you might have said, were in the middle class. It was essentially a society that was divided between rich people and aristocrats and poor people who had lives that were short, miserable, and whatever it is that Thomas Hobbes had to say about them. So basically zero. Through the Industrial Revolution, through the First World War, the Second World War, middle class is developing essentially in North America, in the US and Canada, of course in Europe, and later on, to a certain extent, in Japan. All of that, when you add it up together, probably meant 1 billion people in the middle class after 150 years after it started. Okay, so now we've gone from 0 to 1 billion people. Well, 1 billion people is already quite a big number, but it's still not a massive number. Then we start to enter into a period essentially of globalization. I'm just going to, I'll come to a bit more detail. But with globalization, you start to get people in many of the populous places in developing countries starting to enter into the middle class. And here, initially, you've got what economists call the East Asia miracle countries, South Korea, and places like that. You've got Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall and convergence of those countries. You've got Latin America finally getting its act together in many of the larger economies. So you start to have, in 30-odd years, another 1 billion people. Now we've gone from 1 to 2 billion, from 150 years to just 30 years. And then what happens? Then what happens is, first, China joins the World Trade Organization. It becomes an integral member of the global economy. And you very rapidly, in maybe 8 years, get another 1 billion people in the middle class, of which half of whom are going to be living in mainland China. Then after that, you have India starting to reform. And in the following 8 years, you get another billion people in the global middle class. And this time it's largely driven by services, by the communications and technology. Everybody knows that India is famous for its software and all things connected to digitalization and the digitalization of the global economy. And so that takes you to today, where we probably have something in the region of 4.2 plus billion people in the global middle class, maybe 4.4. And now we're looking forward to 2030, and if things continue as they are, we'd be talking about 5 billion people. So suddenly you've gone from 1 billion, zero, it took a long time to get to 1 billion, relatively, one generation then to get to 2 billion, but from 2 billion to 3 billion to 4 billion to 5 billion, we've been talking about adding an extra billion people to the middle class every 7 or 8 years. Don't take these dates exactly. I hope you all understand these numbers are but it's to give you an order of magnitude of what's been going on. So huge acceleration and scale. And that's going to be a topic that comes through the rest of this talk. So before I get too far ahead of myself, let me just quickly try to give you a sense of what do I mean by the middle class and why do we, and it goes back really to the ancient Greeks. Aristotle had this term, it was called eudaimonia. What is the best possible life that one could lead? And his answer was, it's not to be poor or a slave, and it's definitely not to be rich, and particularly a politician in the old Athenian times. It was to be in this so-called middle class. And he talks about, well, what are the characteristics of this good society? What's the objective of the city-state? And it's to develop citizens who have human flourishing. It's centered around, its community and with a certain element of stability. There's dignity in work, there's generosity towards your neighbors, there's meaning to your life. All these kinds of things are what we now think of as being the middle class. So that's the kind of the ideal. What do we actually have right now? What we have is a middle class where consumerism has scaled much faster than the institutions and the ecosystems and our ability to adapt social norms. And so we've got all kinds of environmental strains. So I mentioned a few, the biggest of which is probably climate and biodiversity loss. We've got social fragmentation because we don't really know how to deal with some of the stresses that inequality is bringing about, and how the middle class should think of themselves in the middle of these battles between the top and the bottom of the distribution. In many places in the world, contrary to what we had expected initially, the middle class is not associated with a strong movement towards democratization, but there's actually been democratic backsliding in lots of places with very large, vibrant, strong middle classes, because the middle class also has considerable fear. And as a result of all of this, declining satisfaction. And let me just quickly, I'll come back. What do we mean by declining satisfaction? So, Gallup takes these polls and surveys and stuff like that. It talks about self-identifying people in the middle class. But if you look at these trends and you look at how many people in the middle class today think of themselves as being very happy, the answer is 29%. It's just not that high. And actually, today, Gallup published a new poll. How many people think that they are satisfied with their life in the United States? Lowest level ever since they started asking the question. Then they asked, and how many people are optimistic about where you will be in 5 years' time? lowest level ever. And in fact, the decline in optimism in the future is even more pronounced than the decline in your estimation of your own life. So there is this sense that now being in the middle class is no longer this ticket to the good life. So if that is the case, then what is? I thought I would just try to, I'm by no means an expert in the local economy, but relate this, because I think that in going back to the Greeks, I mean, the middle class came out of the notion of the city-state and what a city can do for you. So just think of yourselves as being middle-class residents of Las Vegas, and think about the way in which, in many ways, Vegas seems, at least to an outsider, to be a real middle-class city. It brings in large numbers of people. Of course, it brings in a lot of rich people to do some of the things, but much of the spectacle and the shows and the things, this is all, it's travel and entertainment and things that a lot of middle-class people are coming to enjoy. But you've also obviously seen here many of the environmental stresses, especially on water. I was interested to hear that, here in the university, it's, becoming neutral with regard to water. So people have to deal with these kinds of things. And, this middle-class economy is subject to a lot of ups and downs. It's very volatile. It's not got that same sense of stability. And whether it's, a policy change that means that Canadians no longer come here for this, or whether it's COVID or something else, there's a great deal of uncertainty in this world. So all of that, I think, is contributing to this sense that the middle class is no longer the ticket to the good life. All right. So I've used middle class an awful lot right now, and I've not actually said, well, what is the middle class, other than this vague thing that kind of people recognize. If you're going to look at trends and numbers and try to quantify, as I did at the beginning, you need to have some kind of definition and metric. And let me start by saying that a metric is not the same as a definition. So a definition can have lots of different elements to it. At the end of the day, a metric has to take all of those and put them on a single quantifiable scale. For an economist, the most obvious things are to put it onto an income or a consumption scale. And there are two big choices to be made. One is what kind of scale. So ultimately, because incomes tend to be quite volatile. Think about things like, if you're a farmer, for example, some years you have a good crop, some years you have a bad crop. But in general, and certainly historically, there was a considerable amount of volatility in income levels. Second, there are lots of ways of having spending. Think about a student. I mean, some of you may have family who happily, pay for your, like I did for my kids when they went to college. If they wanted to go out to a meal, they went out to have a meal. They didn't have any income, but they sure as hell spent a lot. Whereas others, especially poorer students, may actually have quite a lot of income because they have to work to support themselves. But they might be spending much less. You wouldn't want to say one is, the poor student is middle class and the other is poor just based on income. So there are those kinds of things. Consumption also lends itself much more readily to comparisons across countries, because when you compare across countries with consumption, you can adjust for inflation and price differences using something called purchasing power parity that economists use traditionally for that kind of thing. And it also helps you in comparing over time. So consumption is a reasonably good, I think, metric for thinking about what defines the middle class. And then the second choice that you need to make is, do we think about the middle class as being something which is absolute, that tells you something about what you can afford in an absolute sense, or something that's relative? So if you go to the literature and you go to look at, say, the Pew Research Council and their definition of the middle class, their definition of the middle class is everybody who falls between 2/3 and twice the median income level in the United States. That's the definition of the middle class in the United States. The problem with that relative definition is that, let's say you go to Kenya and you find that the distribution is about the same. But would you really want to say that there are as many Kenyans in the middle class as there are Americans in the middle class? I mean, it just doesn't add up, doesn't really make sense. So I think if you want to think about cross-country comparisons, if you want to think about changes over time, I mean, with the Pew definition, one of the features about spending distributions is they're incredibly stable over long periods of time, especially in the middle. So the share of the population that falls into that Pew definition has barely changed from the 19th century to today. Well, but there's been enormous progress. Wouldn't we want to say that there are many more people in the middle class today than there were there? So that's basically the reason why what I've done is chosen absolute definitions and consumption metrics that are more readily comparable over time and across places. Once you've decided on how you're going to measure it, then you need to do two things to determine the middle class. You need a threshold that tells you everybody below this threshold I'm going to call poor or vulnerable. And you need another threshold that tells you everybody above this threshold I'm going to call rich. Everything else I'm going to call middle class. So that's basically what I've done. And there are lots of ways you can go back to say, how do you define the thresholds? If anybody's really interested in that, I've got academic papers you can read. I've got the book you can read, or you can just take it from me. But essentially, that gives me these two thresholds, what I've called $12 per person per day of spending and $120 per person per day of spending. That defines the middle class. I'll give you a little bit of a sense of what it also means. The middle class is the class that is actually making what I call economic choices. More or less, poor people don't get to make any choices. They get to survive. I mean, they take what they can get and they have to essentially spend that on just survival. Rich people don't make any choices. If they want something, they buy it. They really don't care what the price is. Everybody in the middle class makes choices. For economists, we say they've got a budget constraint. They've got a certain amount they can spend, and they've got to fit everything that they spend into that budget. The middle class is the class that makes choices and makes them responsibly in a way that helps them build their prosperity and their families. So that's the kind of the core idea here. All right. Now I'm going to give you like a really quick snapshot of 250 years of economic history. So we start in 1820, there's no middle class, and what happens? We have the Industrial Revolution. And with the Industrial Revolution, you start to get education, you start to get health, you actually start to get basically skilled workers. You have skilled workers. For the first time ever, they actually get salaries. They don't get daily wages, they get salaries, and they all go and live in urban areas, in towns and cities, so they have more stable incomes. Once they have stable incomes, they can actually buy things. and you get factories that make things mass consumption. Consumption drives technological improvement, drives down prices, expands the offering of the kinds of goods and services that are there. You get economic growth, population growth, big middle class, and it all goes back to the beginning. So you've got this great virtuous cycle in the economic sphere that is generating prosperity. It doesn't just happen automatically. And I do want to emphasize that the middle class as a class has always exercised a political, it's been a political force to support their own interests. Voting rights for women. It's a middle class agenda. It was a middle class issue. It was forced through by the middle class. Free trade was in Victorian England, the so-called repeal of the Corn Laws, which was not about corn but about wheat, but that's because the English don't really speak English in a satisfactory way, was a middle class agenda. The conservatives who were in power were fiercely against allowing grain, in this case from the continent, largely from Portugal and Spain, to come into Britain and drive prices down, because the landed gentry made all their money from their estates. They were the big landowners. So they were vehemently against the middle class. The middle class forced it through partly. It was a response to take the edge off, because the physical rebellion, there were many incipient revolts at that time in England, and they started to get scared that this whole thing was going to build up into a really big conflagration. So all these other things that we think about as the welfare state, free education, university systems, social security, things like these are all middle class agendas, all things that the middle class has used their power as a class to push forward. I don't want to say and be naive to say that the middle class is this always virtuous kind of group, and I think it's really important to recognize that the middle class is also the class that was behind fascism, behind the rise of the Nazis in Germany and Mussolini. It was very much a middle class agenda. The middle class was behind eugenics, the theory that you could breed a superior human being. That was all part of being modern and scientific at the time, or dressed up in that way. So there have been lots of false turns, but for every false turn, I would say the middle class has been very pragmatic. And when they've seen that things aren't really working that well, they come back and say, okay, let's change. And that's a little bit of the hope for the future. In all of this first billion, one of the things that happens is that environmental costs completely ignored, because it didn't really matter that much. You could still do it because the scale was small. It doesn't mean that there weren't the same levels of environmental costs. It just means that the price was not so high for society. So we developed a template for prosperity, for economic growth, for the way in which market economies functioned, which ultimately has proven not to be socially and environmentally scalable to this level. And that's what has come out of the Industrial Revolution, where we are today. Then you have this very quick spread of the middle class, as I said, across the world. So, remember, mid-1970s, you start to talk about globalization, you start to talk about trade. There are three big segments of the world. You have the so-called East Asia miracle economies that are starting to really grow rapidly. focused on trade. You have the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and all these countries, Poland, Hungary, etc., acceding to the EU. And in the ensuing decade, their incomes rose and they converged very rapidly towards European standards. And you have Latin America, where finally these big economies like Brazil in particular, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina finally start to get their act together and build a middle class. Add it all up with the continued growth of the middle class in other areas, and you get this 2 billion in 30 years. But you don't get any change in the structure of the economy. This is an expansion of the middle class based on globalization and trade. 3 billion, as I said, is basically China. I think people forget how quickly and rapidly China has evolved. If you go back just 20 years to 2006, there were very few Chinese who anyone would call middle class. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics was looking at wage rates in China, in the industrial sector, in 2007, I believe, the average wage rate was $1 an hour. Hopefully no students here are making less than $1 an hour. I mean, this is, China was poor. Chinese households were really poor. And the Chinese Communist Party comes along and they say, we've got to do something about this. Ultimately, our success is going to depend on building a middle class and, interestingly, building entrepreneurs who they saw as being critical to the success of the middle class. And so Xi Jinping gives a speech where he talks about the China dream, and nobody quite understands whether he's having a sly reference to the so-called American dream, which was extolling the middle class in America, or something else. Doesn't really matter, because what they wanted to do was to control the expansion of the middle class. And they've been massively successful in doing that based on manufacturing. But there are a couple of things that are interesting about the Chinese experience. One, at that time, people in the West, when President George Bush, senior first, was behind allowing China to enter into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And one of the things he said is, there's never been a society in the world that has allowed goods to be traded into their country without also allowing freedom of the movement of ideas. And the way in which this was sold to Congress here was to say, when we bring China into the WTO, they will start to build a middle class and democratize. And that was the prevailing wisdom of political scientists at the time, that you would automatically get democratization with the expansion of the middle class. It never happened. There may be many reasons why, but from an empirical point of view, it didn't happen. The second thing I think that's important about China is, when you have a middle class growing at that rate, the magnitude of the environmental stresses show up really easily. So Beijing had something called the apocalypse in 2007. Actually, London had exactly the same thing, Great London Smog of 1952. In the apocalypse, I don't know, I was not in Beijing at that particular time, but people said, it's a weather event. Basically, as I'm told, you get a lid of warm air that stops essentially all the pollutants from blowing away, and China was still relying on coal-fired power plants to generate electricity. So all this stuff just sort of sat on top of Beijing. You couldn't see anything. you could see maybe 10 stories of a building, and then it all went into smoke. Buses were driving into buildings and having accidents, and nobody quite knows how many people ended up dying, but the impact on health was really dramatic. And then you had other scandals. There was a huge scandal of adding melamine to milk that poisoned a number of infants, and so all these things that one almost takes for granted in a mature middle-class economy were starting to emerge. And it's an example of where the middle class starts to actually show its political power, even in a state like China, which is controlled by the Communist Party. They have to respond. And I'm going to come back to why that is so important. Fourth billion is basically India. What's unique about India is this is a middle class which is not actually dependent on manufacturing. It's much more dependent on services. It's also a case where, unlike in other places, the middle class doesn't engage with the government and look to the government for services to help it prosper. It does the reverse. It exits. And the middle class in India, they have their own schools that they pay for. They have their own hospitals and hospital care. They have their own generators. They're not really looking to the government to do anything other than get out of the way. So it's a very different type of class from that point of view. And interestingly, again, a little bit like China, the rise of the Indian middle class is not associated with more liberal values. Actually, quite the reverse when you look at these World Social Surveys and things like that. Many Indians are becoming more conservative. They have elective abortions of girls because they want to have fewer children, but they want to make sure that they're boys. So you have these big kind of disparities that are growing. So now we come to the 5th billion, and this is like the second part, which is, so, okay, if we have all these ills, what do we do? And, okay, so I've gone through, so the truth is that the middle class, satisfying the middle class has led to hugely unsustainable production and consumption. That it's leading to deep anxiety. It's now, the middle class is large enough, probably to destabilize the world, which it's currently doing, I would argue, but also to save it. So how? So the first thing I think that is starting to happen is a very new relationship between young people in particular and the nature of work. And we used to have a model, people like myself. You work more, you earn more, you buy more, be happy. It's just not a model that is functioning any longer. That model isn't delivering. And so in place after place, you get people who are opting out of that model. In China, it's called lying flat. Here, it's called quiet quitting. In Japan, it's called karoshi. I mean, there are lots, in almost every country in the world with a large middle class, you find people in the middle class who are saying, no, enough. So there's a rejection of this kind of burnout culture and a real skepticism about the benefits of the from consumption that kind of model brings. And instead, you've got this notion of flexibility. Work now should be something which is much more flexible. You can work from home. It should be something that is purpose-driven. Most people today, certainly when you look at surveys of young people, they say they want to work for a company that is doing something positive for society, not just make some money. People want to make a difference. And that is exactly what the nature of work in the middle class looked like at the time of the ancient Greeks. So the first element of what's changing, and it's perhaps changing slowly, and there's lots of pushback. We had a big push forward with COVID-19. Now there's a bit of a backlash against it. But I think the fundamental wheels have been set in motion to drive this forward as a trend. Second, we've obviously got to move towards a much more sustainable basis for production and consumption. From a technical point of view, it just isn't that hard to do. I mean, there are 4 steps, and we know exactly what those 4 steps are. Step 1 is you've got to transform power into renewable-based electricity. And nuclear is included in renewables. Step 2 is you've got to change all the appliances that we have so they use electricity instead of fossil fuels. Step 3 is there are going to be a bunch of sectors, so-called hard-to-abate sectors, cement, things like that, planes, very difficult to imagine that you can load up a plane with batteries and have them be electric. The batteries are so heavy it would take even more power to get them off the ground. So there are these hard-to-abate sectors, but there are technical solutions for what to do about it. And finally, change your lifestyle. And it's not necessarily something that has to happen with these big agreements. You know, people say Kyoto Climate Agreement or the Paris Agreement or something like that. It actually starts with quite local steps. So someone put this together for me. I trust that it's right. I have to say I'm not quite sure, but I'm told that Nevada's got a goal to generate 50% of its electricity from renewables by 2030 and 100% by 2050. That would be great. It's an example of action at the local level, that it is moving to have certain elements of the city all powered by electrics. There's transportation. We were talking earlier about, wouldn't it have been great if there'd been more emphasis to light rail and things like that rather than to other things? Well, you win some, you lose some. There's now something called the sustainable aviation fuel, which is being developed mostly out of biofuels. And then you've got this very big item, which is about consumer choices. I don't think people fully understand exactly how big your everyday choices are. So here are a couple of facts. Look at the top graph. This is your daily carbon emissions depending on what you eat. So we all know that if you eat a lot of red meat, basically beef and lamb, that's the worst possible diet from a climate emissions point of view, the highest amount of greenhouse gases. And as you go down, you get lower and lower. But look at the amounts. You can almost cut things in half, not by going to the extreme of being a vegan. Incidentally, the reason why the vegan diet is so low is not because of the production of vegetables, but because you often don't have to cook them. So there's no energy that's taken in the cooking process. But you can do an awful lot with that. And what are some of the side benefits? One of the massive side benefits is what happens to land use. Right now, almost all in this country, I think it's 90% of arable land goes to feed animals, not to feed humans. We then, of course, eat the animals, but animals turn out to be rather an inefficient way of converting cereal calories into human calories. So there's a lot that one can do from changes in lifestyles, and changes in lifestyles will be essential to move towards sustainable production. That's why we call it sustainable production and consumption. It's not just on the production side. So I think we need to move out of this kind of, more. The progress is always more. Progress is not always more. It's about both having some more and having what I would call more quality. It's about doing things the right way as well as just having more of it. And that is, in essence, the big choice that the middle class of today faces. You don't have to be perfect. I think it's a choice. I mean, some people say, well, this is something for, as I said, it's not something for national governments. It's not something for state governments. It's something for everyone. It's for companies. It's for households. It's for individuals. And it starts with small steps. And we are taking small steps. The key here, and the distinguishing feature from many other challenges, is that when you're dealing with climate, timeframes matter. If you can't get this under control fast enough, there are so-called tipping points. When species go extinct, you can't then say, oh, sorry, just give me a couple of years more and I'll fix it. They're extinct. So when you're faced with these tipping points, there is this kind of big trade-off and rush, which is quite different from the usual way that economics and societies deal with their problems. They make mistakes, then they just figure out, well, this might work, and they end up hopefully getting onto the right track. You can't really afford to do that with climate change. So who drives change? It is ultimately going to be the middle class, and it's going to be the middle class in every single country in the world. And one of the reasons why I took you through this kind of painful thing about the middle class here and the middle class there is that it is only because we have a large middle class in every important economy in the world, each of whom is pushing their government to do something, that we have a chance collectively of something being done. Because no government is going to, quote unquote, save the planet, but they might do something to respond to their own voters. What kind of change is needed? I think we've got a pretty good idea about sustainable production and consumption. As I said, luckily, the technological advances are big. The when is obviously now, because we're already very late in this process. The where, this is really something for everyone. I put in the slide that it should start in advanced economies with the highest consumption, but that's largely because at the end of the day, the solutions to this are going to come from technological advancements. And where is technology advancing most rapidly in all of the new businesses and the new business models that are going to be required for sustainable production and consumption? It is largely in advanced economies. And that's one reason why people look to advanced economies to really provide these kinds of technological solutions. A problem that we have, and I don't think we should ignore it, is that there's huge pushback. There are quite a few governments, as we saw in the most recent UNFCCC conference on climate change, quite a few governments and most of the big oil companies that are actively and fiercely resisting and using all of the same tools that the cigarette companies used. False data, false science, muddy the waters, deny, ignore, delay. It's a proven technology, and it's very harmful. But it is something that needs to be recognized and frontally addressed. And then last, how can one even start? Well, apart from the vote and the kind of ability to pressure governments, there's an enormous strand of people voting with their wallets. When, I buy coffee or my wife buys coffee, if something has fair coffee on it, I'm prepared to pay a little bit extra because I think it might help. I don't really know, but it might. And that actually, funnily enough, has emerged as a hugely powerful force across a number of brands. And when these big companies now look at the consumer-oriented brands, almost everyone, despite this anti-woke pushback, et cetera, none of the companies are moving away from sustainability. They've all recognized that actually the future of their business, and they're not doing it because of save the planet, they know that they can charge more and make higher profits because people in the middle class are prepared to pay more if they think it's the right thing to do. So this is gradually kind of building. I was talking to somebody, in financial markets, the size of sustainability bonds has now exceeded $1 trillion. It sounds like a big number, and it is a big number. It's still small compared to the total global bond market, but global capital markets are moving in this direction. So markets are actually moving in this direction and can be pushed further and faster by the middle class, and that's another huge part of the middle class power in driving this kind of change. So I'm optimistic at the end of the day. I do see these forces in motion the forces are moving us in the right direction. The question is really, will they be fast enough and strong enough to get us there before we face real problems? And will we then be able to have the flexibility and the freedom of choice, including of how we use our own time, to really take the advances in prosperity that technology will give us, to take that and make it into a better life for ourselves? Do we have the imagination to say it's not just the material consumption, it is all of these other things that we think contribute to a good life that we want to strive for and that we want to work towards? And I think if we can put those two things together, then we can have 5 billion people in a middle class that is actually truly happy by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you, Homi. I would be shocked if this audience didn't have a question or two. Is there anybody who would like to get us started? We just want to get this recorded for the sake.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Mac. My question has to do with increasing the size of the middle class while also addressing climate change, right? So back when we were doing the Paris Climate Accords, I remember learning about how China and India were pushing back against a lot of the goals, the emission drops, because they were like, we're rapidly developing our economies. The Western countries have had centuries to pollute the planet and build wealth, and we're finally getting a piece of the pie, and you want us to slow down. And so I'm wondering, is that still an issue in terms of trying to get international cooperation on global emissions standards? And then also, how do new developments like AI affect that, right? Because we talked about how India has grown its middle class with like IT, right? And now AI could completely replace entire sectors within the IT world. And then, when it comes to manufacturing, right? Like, are we selling less in order to stop polluting as well? Like, if manufacturing drops, how are less wealthy countries supposed to build their middle classes?
Great. So back at the time of the Paris Climate Accords, technology hadn't advanced to where it is today. The reason why the China-India issue has gone away is because of technology. And when I say technology, what I mean is that both countries have realized that actually everybody understands that in order to develop and prosper, you need energy, and you need the lowest cost energy possible. Well, guess what? It turns out that the lowest cost energy possible today is solar panels and wind by a pretty large margin. And both countries have invested absolutely massively in those two technologies. So China today has, all of the investments that they've made, all of the new generation that is coming on stream is with these new technologies. They still have the legacy of all of the old power plants. I don't want to say that they've completely moved, but they've moved phenomenally fast. China has put in place more renewables capacity last year than the rest of the world combined. So they're not waiting around, and they're not doing it, as I said, to save the planet. They're doing it because they've realized that this is really smart economics. And let me tell you, not only have they think of these things very strategically. There's an entire ecosystem. So it's how do you develop the grid? So they put massive amounts of money into the grid. In this country, we bounce around and we say sometimes, oh, we're going to be for it, then we're going to be against it, and it's all piecemeal. Today, there are waiting times of solar connections to the grid that can be, 8 months, 9 months. No one has invested in the grid. Nobody's understood that you actually need to have something that goes together on this. So if you want these kinds of big structural changes, that's basically what you need. And the Chinese in particular have made this into a source of massive comparative advantage. Instead of exporting cheap plastic toys, the Chinese are exporting the most sophisticated vehicles in the world today, and all the rest of the world, except here where it's basically prohibited, are snapping them up. So that part of it, I think, has kind of just technology has broken that barrier. It's not true in everyone. You can go through item by item on these things, and it's not true in every single area that technology has already reached the point, but we're getting very close for most of the things, except for the so-called hard-to-abate sectors, where there's still a considerable amount of investment to do. The second question that you had on the nature of work and AI is a little bit trickier. Work, what people call decent work, dignified work, whatever, has always had a very central role in the middle class. It's the source of their income. Having a good wage. Much of the middle class, certainly in Europe, was driven by the power of unions to ensure that some of the benefits of productivity were properly distributed across society. So work has always been central. Technological change in the past has by and large substituted for something that I would call toil. Some people would call it manual labor or brawn labor. By and large, that's been a good thing because it's pushed people towards more work based on brain and creative labor. AI is coming after creativity. We don't really know and understand, I'm certainly not going to predict, how that's going to affect. Obviously, you need people to link with AI, and so far, in many of the applications, we are observing that it's the combination of people and AI that delivers you better results than either people on their own or AI on its own. But I'm not enough of an expert to know whether that is going to continue into the future. And if it doesn't, then we will have prosperity, and we will have to figure out a way then of how one, essentially a way of redistribution, how one takes that prosperity and makes sure that societies, by and large, feel that it is benefiting them. Otherwise, there'll be all kinds of reactions.
Thank you for your talk. It seems to me that I've worked on environmental issues since the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in Cleveland. And it seems as if politics are the greatest impediment to getting anything done. And in the case of Nevada, it's going to take a severe water constraint problem, I think, to force us to do things. And that may be the same thing worldwide. But it just seems like so many people ignore the obvious, the dangers of climate change and just the cost of it. So I don't know how we get around the political end of it.
So I think you're absolutely right that, to get movement in politics often requires some kind of a crisis. And that's why I talked about the apocalypse in, Beijing or, food safety or, any of these other things. I mean, there are plenty of anecdotes about the way in which crises end up with. So the problem that we have is whereas an apocalypse can be fixed because you just close down all the coal-fired power generation plants and move them out of Beijing. If the icebergs in Antarctic melt, you can't refreeze them. So we need to figure out some way of having a different early warning system. And the way that we thought we had found was science. And we set up all these things, the UNFCCC and all these other scientific bodies to tell us this is what is going to happen. This is what science tells us. But then science gets ignored, science gets falsified, and science gets undermined. So it's a huge problem, and I think you're absolutely right that that's at the heart of the difficulties that we face.
One more.
Hi, Ellie here, master's level student taking a class called Illicit Economies in Criminal Justice. My question is about your mention of the power of consumerism in the middle class, but I wonder if there's a disconnect between the power of that consumerism and the power of capital gains by investments of the ultra wealthy, right? So I took a snapshot on the World Inequality Database where I saw the top 10% wealth inequality share, same countries, USA, France, UK, South Africa, and it's the same countries that are the top 10% emitters. But that makes me question whether it's so much that consumerism is driving investment decisions by the ultra wealthy or whether they're going to continue making those same types of decisions despite changes in consumerism.
So, no, I think that they will follow the lead of consumers. So if you look at the Fortune 500 largest companies in the world, there is no question that they have all moved quite significantly towards trying to embed sustainability into their brands. Whether they are doing it fast enough or not is a different matter, but they're definitely moving in that direction. One big problem that we have is that that is true of consumer-facing businesses. Consumer-facing businesses are a big chunk of the economy, but not the only chunk of the economy. And when you look at so-called B2B businesses or businesses that are associated with, let's say, national security or government contracts or things like that, they don't care. You know, one of the biggest things that would change markets would be if governments introduced sustainability into procurement practices. They don't. So, you know, unfortunately, what we're left with is the consumers. But this trend is very strong. So I'm not concerned that somehow it will get, you know, bottled back. And in some places, it is passed in legislation. So if you look at the EU, for example, now, there is considerable legislation about the design of products, so that the old kind of model of, you know, essentially make, consume, and toss is much more of a cradle-to-grave, so-called life cycle model, where companies are responsible for the disposal of their products at the end of the life cycle, and that makes them invest in technologies so that they can reuse it, because that's cheaper than managing the disposal in otherwise wasteful ways. So there are a whole bunch of legislative things like that. The ban on single-use plastics is another example that are happening. But again, the question is really not, is it the direction of change? It's the speed of change. That's very hard to judge.
Thank you.
We have one more over here.
Good evening. I really found the topic of, and I want to make sure, I think it was eudaimonia, I think was the term utilized, from Aristotle, really interesting. I'm very interested in philosophy and such. And so I was curious, how do we quantify that like level of happiness? And then what are the indicators that we can look for to see when we hit that point, how we know it's working, our changes are working?
There's an entire academic branch of the economics of happiness. And I don't want to get into it now, but now you have lots of national statistical offices in the UK and New Zealand and other places that are starting to ask a number of questions that social scientists then use, a little bit like the Gallup survey, to give you indications. And they break it down into so-called hedonic measures. And there are some things about, you know, did you smile? Did you frown? How often? Did you laugh? To other things that are more, you know, quality of life. There's something called the Cantrell scale that tells you something about where do you think you stand today, what, you know, your optimism for the future, etc. So there is actually a fair amount now of quantification of that going on. And it is some of that evidence that has led to something known as the Easterlin paradox in economics, which very crudely says happiness goes up until your income level hits about 75,000, and then some people say it either flattens out, or some people even say it starts to go down. But there's this kind of the basic idea is this old story that money can't buy happiness. And the answer is, yes, it can, up to a certain point, but then it probably doesn't.
One more question here, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I appreciate the fact that you focused a lot on technology and how it's going to be relevant to our future. However, you took what seemed to me a scarcity approach in terms of our natural resources, the things that we need in order to keep and sustain an economy. I'm a native of Las Vegas. You mentioned our water. I think it serves as a really interesting example about how scarcity and doling out scarcity is actually a very negative thing for the environment. As an example, we have plenty of water. We have plenty of water in North America. We just don't have it where it's needed. We have plenty of land in the desert. And the desert's actually a very important place to be able to farm because we have less weather challenges that we have in the rest of the country. So I would challenge that for all the young people in here that want to prosper, that really we don't prosper with scarcity, we prosper with abundance, and we need to create abundance to that end, and we need to utilize technology to that end. And I think that by bringing resources to where they needed to be, particularly I'm just focusing, of course, on North America. I'm not interested in the Amazon being cut down and burned up. I mean, we have lots of problems in the world, but I think a scarcity model, I think that there's a balance somewhere that I think we're talking, maybe we're on the same page. I don't know. I didn't feel like it. I just feel like that I'm looking at my environment and my community, and I feel like it is being degraded every day because of our water policies being born from scarcity, not seeking that abundance. So anyway, thank you.
You know, it could be a discipline vocabulary. Economists love to talk about scarcity. We're known as the discipline of, how you manage scarcity. But the idea of managing scarcity to its best extent is essentially the idea that by managing scarcity, by managing it positively, it generates the greatest prosperity and abundance. So I'm not sure if we're on a different page or whether it's a vocabulary that's coming from different disciplines. But I do think that I would probably disagree with you that the kind of the model of just more is a model that is ultimately going to bring us success. Because you more and greed. Yeah, but it's not just that. It's that we need models and technologies that everyone in the world can use. And if we develop things that say, well, this is how we are going to live our lives, but the rest of you, are left to yourselves, I don't think that that's going to work. And I think, for better or for worse, the things that other people do will affect all of us. The kinds of global challenges that I talked about are things that will affect all of us. And so I think it's up to us in places that are able to experiment the most with different types of technology to develop these technologies.
I agree with that. I absolutely agree with that.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the clock. I want to be respectful of people's time. So we'll draw some of the public part of the program close, but if you still have questions, Homi will be around for a little while. I want to thank you for coming out and for your questions, and I want to invite you back to this room at this time in the not too distant future when we'll bring out another Brookings colleague in early February. Vanessa Williams will join us, and she'll be talking about something I think is incredibly...
Early February is kind of gone, Bill, you know.
Sorry. Actually, when is Vanessa coming out? It's
March.
Early March, right? Excuse me. There are flyers outside, so
I look just like her. He gets confused.
That will give you the exact date and time. But we'll be back here, and something she'll be addressing a topic important to the middle class, but to wherever you find yourselves, and that's the impact of tax policy and where we may be going in that direction. So I hope you'll be able to join us then. Thanks again for coming out today.